Okay, good morning. Hello, my name's Lorna. I'm a developer advocate with Nexmo. Are any of you already familiar with Nexmo? Can you give me a show of hands? Oh, it's a few. Excellent. And a colleague. Good. Well done. For those of you who don't know us, Nexmo do telephony APIs, so if you need to make a phone call or send a text, we have APIs for that, which means we're completely obsessed by APIs. And in addition to being obsessed by APIs, I personally am also obsessed by documentation, and I am therefore delighted to bring you a session introducing you to OpenAPI Specification. To sell OpenAPI Spec as a documentation thing really sells it short, like really short. OpenAPI Spec is a really good way of describing your APIs and creating great documentation from them. Like, it's so good that if you only want to create documentation, this is a good way to do it. But with a specification for your API, you can also create a large number of other things. So to say that it's about documentation is oversimplifying it. But it's a docs conference and it's a short slot, so maybe I don't need to apologize. What's cool about describing your API? Having a description of your RESTful API, there are other description languages for other types of APIs, but modern, RESTful-ish APIs, you want OpenAPI Spec. And we are describing the API in words that even a machine can understand. So that's the goal, is to create something that can be handled by a machine. What's cool about API description is it keeps the kind of API detail away from the details of the things you're creating. So it really separates content and presentation. How to annoy a room full of documentarians. Refer to documentation as just documentation. Slide 2, here we go. It enables things that are not just documentation. Like, you are probably going to be doing this because you want to create great reusable documentation, but it also opens the door to lots and lots of other things. API documentation is super important. It's my passion. If you're not going to document your API in an awesome way, don't build it because it's no use. Right? It's really, this is central, this is key. But sometimes developers and documentation just don't mix. So giving them an API spec that's reusable can be super, super powerful, right? Developer experience is about giving developers what they need to succeed, and sometimes they are not going to manage with your docs because that's not their thing. By creating the API specification for your document, this can be powerful for lots of reasons. I like it in the design stage of the API. I really like it really early in the process. By describing your API in a way that can be used and looked at in lots of different ways, you're enabling lots of different stakeholders to join the discussion about how that API should look and how it should be. You haven't invested engineering time and resource in building the API with all the caching, authentication, logging, and everything else that comes with it. So this is a really cheap and effective stage of the project to discuss the details. When you're discussing over an OpenAPI spec, you can be generating documentation, but you can also be generating a mock server for engineers to make some calls against and see how that looks and try it for fit. Right? It enables lots and lots of people to contribute. In a previous life, I used to rescue legacy PHP projects. This is a lot more fun than it sounds, by the way, because I'm sure it sounds like a nightmare to some people. I loved it, and we did a really good site which was to do with like booking holiday lets. And one day it was like, the client says he needs read and write access to the database. No. And it turned out, yeah, he actually did need to be able to read and write a little bit to the database. So we put in an API, but we had to ship the feature like yesterday. So we shipped the API documentation and went backwards and forwards, the business people, the technical people, all discussing on documentation. And when I came to actually write the API, it took about 3 hours because everything was already nailed down. We'd argued about error formats. Right, that was done. So I really like this as a way of developing APIs from the beginning. If you want to filter down the steps, there are some seats. I can see them down here. Okay. Let's talk about OpenAPI spec specifically. So OpenAPI specification is an API description language. It's from an earlier version which was called Swagger. So some of you might be familiar with Swagger. Same kind of awesome, but the trademark Swagger belongs to a company called Smart Bear. And they donated their standard to the community. So we have a wide group of community and industry players who are responsible for OpenAPI spec. Some really good people, individuals as well as companies. So if you're familiar with Swagger and all the goodness that brings, OpenAPI spec is the correct way to refer to the current iteration of that thing, but all the same goodness applies. After it became OpenAPI spec, there was a version 3 released. Some of the tools are version 3 compatible, but still have Swagger in their names. Some of them are not yet version 3 compatible. Lots of them have made promises to me. So if your favorite tools are not quite on v3 yet, just hang in there. I think OpenAPI spec is very well supported across community and industry. It's a real meeting of minds. And I think it will become expected. If you're working with APIs and you're not doing this yet, this will be our new normal. Those of you who have worked with SOAP APIs, they're a little bit out of fashion in web development. They're still very useful in other areas of software development. Right? We used to use something called WSDL, Web Service Description Language, for SOAP, and people would literally just take your file that described the API, plug it into their editor, and magic would happen. OpenAPI spec is that for RESTful APIs. I'm often asked whether this is only useful for new APIs, whether it's worth trying to retrofit to the old ones, whether the design phase is crucial, whether it's a better fit for one or the other. The answer is yes. It's not always easy to apply a specification to an API that wasn't designed for it. At Nexmo, we did. Our new APIs are designed spec first, but we have some existing APIs, anything older than a year, which is a good proportion of our APIs. We applied the spec afterwards. It's absolutely doable. I think it's valuable. I'm not going to tell you it's always easy. The places that are a little bit sticky, that are tricky to describe that API in a standard way, are the places where your API was a little bit non-standard and unfamiliar to developers in the first place. So it can be quite informative when you do it, but I think it applies to both the old and the new. I don't think you need a greenfield project for this stuff to be useful. Who gets involved in OpenAPI specs? Well, I think it's kind of a team effort. So if you identify as any of these types of people, even better is if you identify as any of these types of people with tendencies towards any other of these 3 types of people, then this is probably your bag. The product owners are really great people to write OpenAPI spec stuff because they have such a detailed and technical understanding of the domain and of the finer points of the API. Like, they have a real deep understanding of how that can work. At Nexmo, it's mostly the product people that work on this. If you are a writer, I think this is also right up your street. OpenAPI spec needs you to describe every aspect of your API precisely and succinctly. It needs a command of language. It's nearly microcopy, right? There's a risk that people kind of just copy and paste all those field definitions and they kind of look all the same as each other. And as writers, as documentarians, we need to express what's specific about each field. And I think it is very valuable for writers to get in on this action. If you are writing API docs, I would expect you to be required to be able to do this in the next 2 to 3 years. But I also think you're awesome at it, and I'd love to have you doing it. So it's a good thing. Also engineering, the target of API documentation is the engineers that use the APIs. So it is fine for engineering to get involved in writing these API docs. I would describe myself as an engineer with writing tendencies. So I quite enjoy working with this stuff. I find it interesting and I find it incredibly powerful. I think it needs a lot of different skills, and I think if you're starting from any one of those three corners, you're really well placed to be successful at writing these kinds of specs. I feel like I'm talking about an imaginary thing. So I'm going to try and show you around as simple as possible an example of OpenAPI spec as I can. So let's talk about the structure. OpenAPI specification it's a tree structure. You can think of it as a table of contents with chapter headings, subheadings, and so on, drilling on down. There are some required elements at the top level, and they are these. The first one you will see at the top of every spec is OpenAPI, and it just describes which version of the spec this document is compatible with. We're currently on 3.0.1 and 3.0.2, has some minor changes and is just around the corner. That stuff's important. The info section. This is interesting. Only a couple of these fields are actually required, and hardly any of the documentation tools really show many of these fields. It's easy to sort of skimp on this section. Because the API description languages are standard, we are going to be able to distribute them. Users will be discovering our APIs through the description language, through finding that API spec listed on catalogs and directories of APIs. Take the time to put some metadata here that will help your future users to find you. I think this is quite subtle. It's easy to miss why this is here, and it's here for when we all start to share our API specs more widely, and we start to find and discover APIs through a more established API marketplace and ecosystem. Where am I up to? Okay, we've got servers. This is where the API endpoint is. The paths section is what you think of as API documentation. There's an element for each URL that you can hit, and within that there'll be one for get, one for post, one for delete, whatever verbs this particular URL supports. And under the verb, there'll be a description of what you can send and which parameters there are. We'll look at an example in a minute, but you get the idea that it kind of, each top level can expand quite a lot. And it's good to work with it in a view that can collapse it again for you. The components section can only be described as a shopping trolley of spare parts. OpenAPI spec allows you to reuse definitions. So you can describe a parameter or an error response in the components section and then just refer to it everywhere it's used. So if we want to change the example data that we show for a particular user ID, then we change it in one place and it renders everywhere. That's quite nice. So we've got parameter schemas, responses. The security schemes go in the components section, and you can also put examples in here and then use those examples to populate your API documentation. When people pull in OpenAPI spec into their IDE and start getting hints on things, again, it can show that example data there. The security section refers to a security scheme you labeled in the components section, because abstraction's really in fashion. That just is. I want to mention the tags in particular. The tags allow you to define tags and then tag different endpoints so that you can group similar or related endpoints together. And Nexmo, we have quite a large number of small APIs. I'm not sure if that's a feature, but it's the way it is. If you have a large API that does a lot of things, I would strongly recommend looking at the tags. And that will enable you to do things like group all the endpoints that handle user account stuff together, and perhaps offer sections of documentation and group things in a logical way. So that's definitely worth it. I want to show you an example. If you don't enjoy looking at screens full of YAML, like football results style, look away now. I would like to I need 4 minutes to show you around. And for an example, I'm using Nexmo's secret management API. You access our API with an API. You access our APIs, some of them, with API key and secret. So you want to be able to rotate that secret for security reasons. This API lets you create a new secret, look at what you've got, and delete the old one. It still doesn't fit on one screen, but it's simple-ish. So you can use JSON or YAML. This is YAML. I could make the argument in favor of either format, I think. YAML feels a bit more like the list I would write for myself in a text editor. It's a little bit more humane, but it's still fundamentally a machine language. There's the OpenAPI version. The service section has the endpoint where you can make API requests to, and we've got a pretty minimal info block. It's a really simple API. I'm not going to lie, there's hundreds more lines in this file. Okay, it gets kind of long-winded. Complicated? No. Long-winded? Sorry. Yes. So this is just the top section. Next, we have the paths. So it looks like this. We've got the URL. You can see a parameter there in the URL. The account ID has the curly braces around it. And this API endpoint, it supports a get verb. If it also supported post, we'd have that as a separate section further down. This account ID parameter is used in basically every endpoint. So we just refer to it in the component section. And we've got some possible responses. You might get a 200 that I have removed. It's on the next slide because I didn't want to make the font any smaller than it is. We've got a 401 and a 404. Both of those are the same, reused in multiple places. So again, we're referring to components. I'm really sorry about the 200 response. It's here. This is the 200 response that would have made the screen unreadable. It's application JSON. It's got a secrets property, which itself contains an array of secrets. And guess what? Each item in the secrets array is referred to in a different location. You're getting the idea, right? We like abstraction. Here's the secret info reference. This is the actual thing that will be returned when you request a list of secrets. You get the ID and the created at. You don't get the actual secret. That's just at create time. But this will tell you the ID so that you can delete things and know what's going on. So we've kind of been on a tour of just a little bit. It's hard to get a whole thing on the screen. The impression that I'm trying not to give you is that it's really complicated, but you just saw 4 screens of YAML, so, your mileage will probably vary. It's not intended to be complicated. It's not rocket science, but it is kind of unwieldy, kind of long-winded, right? You are going to want to have some tools to help you, and I'll drill through those in a minute. Now we've got this API spec. What can we do with it? Well, hey, you're documentarians. Let's start with the documentation example. The font's a bit tiny, but you get the idea. We've got the API call that you can make and the details of that on the left-hand side. We've got some response data on the right-hand side. So users can kind of expand different bits and look at the exact description or examples for each parameter that they're supposed to send and send it through. This is Redoc. It's an open source tool for rendering documentation. You can take this and plug it into your site today. I tend to work with any standard docs renderer. It is usually Redoc when I'm working on an OpenAPI spec locally. Once it's ready, it'll go onto Nexmo's developer portal. So that same YAML file just gets rendered like this instead. So I can use the same source and produce quite different outputs. I mean, here our emphasis is completely different. We've kind of folded up the response field descriptions. You can drill into that if you want to. Some of the layout's similar, some of it's different. Also, I had to retake this screenshot because we just madly rebranded our dev portal site about 3 weeks ago with no changes to the API documentation. We just rebranded it, and that's fine. I didn't need to do anything with our specs because the content is safe and separate from the things other people do with presentation. Hello, API specialist for a reason. Front end, not my thing. But I really enjoyed that I didn't have to go and do a lot of messing about with existing documentation. It just all worked. Okay, so you're not going to do this with Microsoft Word or Google Docs, so let's talk a little bit about tools. I would say OpenAPI Spec is amazing, the community is amazing, and the tools are getting there really quickly. So you will probably have to hunt for what works for you, but this is, I have only been doing this for, well, I've been in Nextmo all that long, so a few months, and the tools are getting better all the time. So yeah, it's a really, really exciting place to be. I'm going to start with a little rant. Please use source control. Female Coder Cat says, please use source control. I speak separately about Git. If you don't know Git, see me after class, or you can buy my book. That'll be fine. I hear a few examples about why things are not in source control. This is a text-based markup file. Even if you work on your own or any of those other excuses that sometimes come up about source control, future you will thank past you for just checking that file in at moments when it's working. Because in the moments where it's not working, it's hundreds of lines long. Your undo buffer might not help you. Like, set yourself up for success. Just learn to commit into Git. I will try not to talk all morning about this. It's really important. Okay. Choose an editor that works for you. Now, your mileage will definitely vary from mine. I'm also a disabled user, so I struggle with quite a few of these tools. Quite interesting. So here are some recommendations from me and kind of secondhand. I am probably not doing justice to your favorite tool, in which case, if you would like to shout at me on Twitter about your favorite tool, I will round it up, put it in the slides before I publish them, and we'll try and do crowdsourced tool recommendations. I really like Atom as an editor. It is lightweight, cross-platform, and GitHub made it, so it speaks Git very fluently. You can get a plugin called Linter Swagger, which is also OAS 3 compatible. This is the secret management API spec in Atom with the tooling, with the Linter Swagger thing. Being able to see the syntax highlight, have it fix your indentation, and collapse sections are things I find incredibly helpful when I'm working with one of these things. Back to the tools list. Try the tools that SmartBear have, so swagger.io/tools. They have things like Swagger UI, which will give you a live preview as you go along, can be quite nice. API Curio Studio, say that fast, gets really good reviews. I haven't used it yet, but it sounds like you should definitely give it a try. I am going to shout out to Stoplight. They are doing some fantastic work in this space. They are not supporting OAS 3 everywhere yet. They've promised me it's on the roadmap for Q1. So special mention to Stoplight. They have some good tools, and they're also really knowledgeable and active in this area. So in the spirit of kind of sharing that knowledge, I think start reading their blog and look for an announcement. Like, read all their good stuff and look for an announcement for the V3 support. There's such good stuff in V3. I think if you're starting afresh today, I would strongly recommend that you go that way. Personally, I mostly use Vim. I'm not sure I'm going to recommend that, but that's what works for me and my abilities or lack thereof. Validation tools. Right. So if you were going to write API documentation, you would just write API documentation. It would be wonderfully readable to humans. Because we are writing specification, which is readable to machines, as far as I'm concerned, the machines can do the hard work. So you should immediately plug in some linting tools. So these are syntax checking tools, tools that literally look for dust and point it out to you, clean it up. And run that every time you save your file. Some of these plugins will come with validators built into the editors. I'm using Specky. Specky.io is a tool from WeWork because Phil Sturgeon, who does API stuff, works there. It's good. It's opinionated. I don't always agree with it, but you can turn individual rules off. So if some of that checking is too strict for you, or you need to add extra checks for something that you're going to build from your spec, it's very customizable. I'm also using OpenAPI spec validator locally, which I quite like. I've put my watch command in here. You should be able to teach your editor to perform a trick every time you save your file. So teach it to perform the is this valid OAS trick, and show you the output every time you save. And that should give you a good process and save you a lot of time. Let's look also at preview tools. You've seen Redoc already, and so I'll definitely recommend that. Specky has a serve command, and that also wraps Redoc. Just give yourself something where you're seeing the documentation. Even if I'm actually writing the code generation, I often review it in the doc because it's quite a nice way to think about what I'm creating and which pieces I've added in. There are other tools available. I've had a recommendation for OpenAPI GUI. Again, shout if there are things you would rather I were recommending from here. And I will do that and try and scale it up so everybody gets the benefit of everybody's wisdom if you follow that logic. Creating OpenAPI specs is like eating an elephant. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Yeah. Well, you didn't really think that through. Okay, anyway, skating over my somewhat flaky metaphor. This is something that you are going to build a cathedral, right? A brick at a time. So write a minimum viable spec, something that will compile and is nothing more. Check it into source control. Wire up the validation tools. Get the preview serving, right? This is going to save you hours of your life, even if it feels like a slow setup the first time that you do it. Find some tooling and then iterate. Don't change 50 lines of YAML at a time. I promise you, you will end up throwing it away and starting again. The voice of experience. Do as I say, not as I do. It's a very iterative process, so just try and add a bit. I like to add things straight raw into the paths section and then refactor into components if I'm going to reuse them. Because at that moment you have to think about what those various reuse points have in common and what they don't. So don't put it in the components section until you are reusing it, even if you know you're going to. Because I think it helps you to really think about what's similar and when it's different. So it's a step at a time, and you will build something that is incredibly useful. OpenAPI spec. It's not just about documentation. I mean, it's a great way to write documentation, and I hope that you all feel terribly inspired and rush home and do it immediately. But also, it's a lot more than that. You can use OpenAPI specifications to generate client libraries. You know, Nexmo has a huge developer advocacy team. We maintain client libraries in 7 languages. Isn't that great for us? Not everyone's in that position. And I think by publishing a specification that will allow developers, every documentation template has download the spec at the top, because developers are going to download that spec and use it for themselves. They're going to use it to generate the helper code that they need. They're going to use it to generate a mock server to practice their calls against and add some logging. We're going to use it to generate tests for the stuff that we do. It can be used and reused. You can create Postman collections. If you're working with APIs, you probably use Postman. You probably have a load of saved requests. You can generate, okay, you have to downgrade to OAS 2 to create it right now. They've promised me it's on their roadmap too. Like Q1's going to be so exciting for V3 on OpenAPI world. There's a lot of things on roadmaps for Q1. You can generate Postman collections and share those with your users. You know, plug your API key and secret in here and quickly get started. The real magic here is the stuff that I didn't mention. That if we watch this talk back on video in a year, we'll be like, oh, she didn't mention this thing that we do as absolute standard that hasn't occurred to me yet. I don't need to do any more work to enable that because I've already written the spec. Developers can come and build whatever they want. I sometimes generate local documentation from other people's OpenAPI specs because I'm a disabled user. I can't hover. Half the time I can't expand it. Rich client interfaces are not everything they're cracked up to be. But I can take that spec and use it in my own way. If I need the documentation in large print, I can generate that. If I need it printable, I can generate that. If I want to make a cheat sheet that is just the paths and what they do, the parameters and none of the examples and descriptions and data types, just the name, I can do that too, all from the same source. And suddenly we're opening doors for documentarians, developers, testers, and discovery of APIs, all off this thing where we thought we were just building documentation. And for me, that's the magic. That we're enabling things that haven't been invented, that haven't even occurred to us, and we don't need to care. We're enabling our users to do everything they need to do, and for me, I think that's amazing. I've got some resources on this slide, but I'll publish the slides. I'll see what you've tweeted at me. Put them on the slides, so you'll see them coming from my Twitter account later. I would love to chat more about this. I'm around all day and in the evening. So all for now, I will just say thank you very much for your attention. Enjoy your day.